Hello, and welcome to this video presentation on the poetry of death. Poetry is one of the strongest forms of writing on the human emotion. It can have so many inspiring interpretations on life and its boundaries. Yet, the idea of death seems to be a very important topic on the abundant amount of poets out there. When we see death, we see it as an end to one's life. However, a poet can see death as a monster that prepares to take them away to another land. Based on how they experience death, they may personify death differently. The concept that we will explore will be the influence of death on the poet. One great poet that seems to intrigue many researchers is Emily Dickinson's curiosity with death. Although most great poets talk about death in their poetry, Dickinson attacks death in a different aspect. Instead of thinking death as a melancholy subject, she views it as a fascinating cryptic phenomenon. Born in Amherst, Massachusetts, Emily went to Amherst Academy, where she gains a growing interest for botany. Her first experience with death happens when her principal dies unexpectedly. She tells her classmates that her only tributes were her tears and that her poetic interest starts to grow. As she grew older, she led a solitary life. Her poetry can be categorized into four types of death: poems dealing with death and immortality, poems dealing with physical aspects of death, poems which personify death, and poems with elegiac note. However, her most notable point of view is about death and immortality. Emily Dickinson's If I Should Die shows her acceptance of her inevitable death. Although these final lines show her depressing revelations on life, she still shows some happiness by referring to it as a pleasing scene. And because she experienced death calmly, she manifested death as a natural occurrence that must be embraced. The next person that I researched on was Lord Byron. Although his childhood consisted of his father abandoning him, he led a pretty good college life, gaining his master's degree and falling in love with someone. However, one day his dog died, and he experienced death for the first time. His first poem about death was an epitaph to a dog. He talks about how his dog fights, lives, and labors with him, and that the heaven won't accept his soul. We can see how Byron hates the gods for not accepting his dog's soul, and that he sees death as a heavenly figure. Another poet in this research is Alan Seeger. Born in New York City, he attended Harvard University. Like all other Harvard students during the 1914, he joined the Foreign Legion of the French Army. Seeger claims that he was doing it for the love of France, as the German army approaches. When Seeger entered the war, he claims that his chances of surviving the war is 1/10. Seeger was shot in February. It was during his injury that he started to see the true horrors of death. In his poem, I Have a Rendezvous with Death, he talks about his close encounter with death in the battlefield, which creates a minor imagery of the Great War. There, Seeger believed that death was with them, and that he personifies death as an enemy in the war. Along with Alan Seeger was Pablo Neruda, who was appointed a diplomatic post in Rangoon in the Far East. He lived there for more than 5 years and didn't see a single Spanish-speaking person over there. During his stay in Vietnam, he wrote multiple poems about his experience there. He was 20 years old and waiting for death. His collected poems were later published in Spain as Residencia en la Tierra. In these poems, his modern perception was man is really a very small part of the universe destined ultimately to be dust in the wind, and that if there are laws to be found in nature, they are not the laws of men, nor are they subject to any human significance. This gives his poem, Nothing But Death, a stronger theme behind it, as he explains death as an admiral who is waiting for them at the afterlife. Unlike Seeger, death is personified as a much more stronger being, as a soldier. The next poet in the list is Edgar Pope, who uses death to its fullest extent. When Poe became 3, both his parents died, and he went to go live with John Allen, who never truly adopted him. He mostly had a good education and was admitted to the University of Virginia. Eventually he stopped a few years later due to bad financing and eventually enlisted to the army. There, he created most of his greatest works. Most of his poem states that nature is used merely as an ornament or as a symbol to fill in the background. All his poems have nothing to do with himself except in any other poetry that refers to his friends and family. His most common themes are either death or darkness. One of Poe's most interpreted poem is The Conquering Worm, where he talks about a man who is stuck in the crypts while a worm slithers around his coffin. The entire poem shows Poe's anger toward God and the angels who watches the man in the coffin as a form of entertainment. Again, we see how death does not have to be a single image of a man in a dark cloak. In this poem, death is personified as God himself, and the cruelty of taking away a life that developed in the life of Poe. We can see how Edgar's life of rejection led to his common darkness in his poems of death. The last poet who uses death as a literary art is Shakespeare. In Shakespeare's Sonnet 55, we see how he uses poetry to keep his old friend alive. By using poetry, he thought he could keep his friend's thoughts immortal and fight the idea of death. By using certain word choices such as live, outlive, and living, he was able to emphasize the idea of this death. In the end, we can see how death has a great influence on how the poet personifies death. Thank you for watching this video presentation on the themes of death.